Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and welcome back to Black History Month. This is our third individual for February in 2026. I'm disappointed that there doesn't seem to be all that much mention of it out there. I don't understand that. I'll just leave that there for everybody to contemplate. In the meantime, I've been doing this for a number of years now, and I've talked about the African American people that are such standouts that you can't avoid talking about them. And I was thinking I wanted to do a writer, and I thought, oh God, everybody talks about Toni Morrison. So I made a little list, and I thought, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Ida B. Wells, who's famous not only for her journalism, but for her activism, Zora Neale Thurston, Alice Walker, and then, there's the guys, Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright. Frederick Douglass was a writer, kind of in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. was a writer. Their oratory, their writing was, well, he also wrote a book, so I shouldn't say that. Just suffice it to say that I was looking for somebody who I feel like gets overlooked. Now, I recognize the name Phillis Wheatley. I know we studied it in American literature in high school, but that was in the dark ages. We were still, using cuneiform tablets. So I went back and I read her life, and I thought, oh my God, we have to talk about her. She had a short life. She only managed to publish one book of poetry. And it was this weird conflux of, excuse me. Well, we'll talk about it. Let's just get into her life. Phillis Wheatley. They don't know where and when she was born. This is, what a way to start out a biography of somebody. Somebody whose life was so out of her hands from the very beginning. They think she was born in 1753-ish, somewhere in West Africa, probably Gambia or Senegal-ish. The story is that she was sold by a chief to a trader when she was about 8 years old. So this is all just starting out on the wrong foot. This is terrible. She arrived in Boston on a slave ship, and we don't need to revisit the horrors of that. Read Middle Passage. July 11th, 1761. She arrived in Boston. She was bought by a guy called John Wheatley, who was a rich man. He was a tailor, and he'd made a good chunk of money. And he bought her. I can't even, this is very uncomfortable to talk about. This is really disturbing. This little 8-year-old girl kidnapped from her home, taken across, and God knows what kind of horrors she went through, arrives in this foreign country and is bought as an object, as a birthday present for this rich guy's wife, Susanna. So I suppose if you want to talk about relative good fortune, she's lucky she didn't end up on a sugarcane plantation or a cotton plantation. That's not to say that there's ever a good way to be enslaved, but her experience was in some ways so different than other kidnapped African Americans. Well, Africans. So she was named, this just gets worse and worse and worse. She was named Phillis after the ship she came over on, and given Wheatley the name of her owners. However, they tutored her, and this was very unusual because usually enslaved people were not allowed to learn to read and write. But she was tutored by their 18-year-old daughter, Mary, and then by their son, John, which that kind of put up my radar too. The father, John Wheatley, was considered a progressive, and he let her read and write, which was just shocking to everybody. He got her an education that was unusual even for a white woman at the time. Interesting. By the time she was 12, she put us all to shame. She could read and write and speak Greek and Latin. She knew the Bible inside and out. By the time she was 14, she had written her first official poem that was addressed to Harvard. They saw her talent and they let her skip doing housework to concentrate on her writing. And they used to show her off like a party piece to their friends. They'd have a big thing, bring Phillis out to do a poem for everybody, and everyone would be, oh, this is just what a trick, you know. It's pretty noxious. But she did a lot of reading, and she was strongly influenced by Alexander Pope, by Milton, by Homer, by Horace, by Virgil. You know, all those guys you had to do in high school lit class that were just onerous. She had chronic asthma, so they took her to London for her health. And when she was in London, some interesting things happened to her. She was able to get her book published. She met with the Lord Mayor of London, and he connected her. She got her poetry subsidized by a rich woman. And her first book came out in 1773. She was also freed in 1773. Susanna died in 1774. And John died 5 years later. 4 years later. I can't do math. 1778. In 1778, she met and married a free black grocer named John Peters. And this is so sad. They were very poor. So now she's free, but she's lost the money that white people spent on her because she was a novelty. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too harsh. They were very poor, she and her husband. And they did have 2 babies. Both babies died like right away. In 1784, her husband was put into prison for debt because that always solves the problem. She became a scullery maid. She had never done anything like that before, but she became a scullery maid. And she did it at a boarding house and ended up with pneumonia. And she died in 1784. Right after giving birth to a little girl, and the baby died too. So she had pneumonia while she was pregnant and working as a scullery maid while she was pregnant. And she died. She was 31. But she wrote all kinds of interesting things. She wrote a letter advocating natural birth, you know, the concept of the Enlightenment, natural born rights, and advocating that slaves had them too, black people had them too. How dare you enslave? Well, she was a little softer about it, but how can you enslave people? We all have natural born rights. She wrote back and forth for a while with an English philanthropist. And in 1775, she wrote a poem to His Excellence, George Washington, which I'm going to read to you. And he invited her to come visit him at his headquarters. He was not the president yet. Thomas Paine republished her poem in the Pennsylvania Gazette in April of 1776. But although she had a collection of poems ready to go as a second book, she never got to publish it because she lost her patronage when she was freed, which is really hard to think about. And she had to go to work. She didn't have any money and she couldn't publish. She is studied now, not just because she was unique for the kidnapped Africans in the colonies at her time, but she was subtly subversive. She was rebellious. to the colonists, about the colonists. She also had a lot of Christian themes and Enlightenment themes in her poetry, a lot of poetry about freedom. She wrote another poem I'm going to read you called On Being Brought from Africa to America. People doubted, that an enslaved person, especially a young woman, could have written such excellent poetry. And they doubted that she did it. They thought it was some kind of party trick. And they examined her by a panel of famous Boston men. And they said, well, you know what? She wrote this stuff. It really was her. Thomas Jefferson. Here's another reason to really wonder about Thomas Jefferson. He would not acknowledge her work. He discredited it. Well, he'd have to explain some things to Sally Hemings, wouldn't he? There's interesting hints in some of her poetry that she remembered her life back in Africa, because there are references to the culture. She had references to solar worship from her African community. And of course, many classical allusions, because she was so well read, so well educated. So let's read this poem on being brought from Africa to America. It's very short. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. I think this is like a not quite so subtle dig. Hello, Christians, but it really reflects the prevailing attitudes. It's difficult to read these things. And here's to His Excellency, George Washington. Just a tiny bit longer, but I thought it'd be fun to read. Celestial choir, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light involved in sorrows and the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair. Olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse, bow propitious while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. As when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms, astonished ocean feels the wild uproar, the refluent surges beat the sounding shore. Or think as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou know'st them in the fields of fight. Thee first in peace and honors we demand the grace and glory of their martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. 1 century scarce performed its destined round when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state! Lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. So you really see all the allusions to classical literature, mythology, archetypical figures that were well known in her time, probably less so now. You know, we don't dip our toe into classical literature very much anymore. She also reflects the hope, the faith that people had in the leadership of the revolution, and the hope that this would work. And I just thought that was such an interesting poem that you could, I understand in not an agreeing with them way, but I get why men at the time looked at a poem like that and said, oh, come on, this little black slave girl could never have written this. Their words, not mine. Of course not. They had blinders on. They were, for all their talk about equality, I just thought it was a beautiful poem. Plus, there's a lot of vocabulary and words in there we'll have to look up, right? So that's all I have to say today about the great Phillis Wheatley. Admire her insight, her wisdom. It would have been so easy to give in to anger and resentment, but she used those as tools to get her point across in a very eloquent way. And I really appreciate that. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I wish I could say Happy Black History Month. These are dark times in history, but we keep the hope alive, right? So thanks for listening, and Slán go fóill. Slánte.